I'm excited to announce our first speaker today. He is a professor at Algoma University, has served as president of the International Association for Great Lakes Research, and served on the International Joint Commission's Great Lakes, oh my God, I can't read that right, advisory board for over a decade. Most importantly, he's returning champion here, and after all of his winter science research, it's not a surprise that he loves a good sauna. Please welcome Dr. Michael Twiss.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Bridget. And thank you for everyone for being here, particularly Miss Ann Ward. It's a pleasure and an honor to be able to share with you the research and collaboration that I've been doing with folks across the Great Lakes Basin for about 20 years now, focused on Great Lakes winter science. And so in this talk, what I'm going to do is explain to you the importance of winter, tell a bit of a story about how I got involved and how others have become involved, and finally talk about a recent IJC report that was produced on this topic. And first of all, as Bridget honorably did, I'd like to also provide a land acknowledgement. We are on traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, guardians of the eastern door of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I come from Sault Ste. Marie. I used to live down here in this territory at Clarkson. I worked at Clarkson University, and I moved to the Sault 3 years ago. And there, I am happy to live safely on Robinson Huron territory, which is the ceded territory of the Anishinaabe Nation. A bit of a story in that when I grew up in Northern Ontario, I grew up just north of the Manitoulin Island, North Shore of Lake Huron. And when I was a kid, I grew up with Indian nations, First Nations surrounding our area. They're everywhere. They're in Manitoulin Island, along the North Shore of Lake Huron. Played hockey with folks. But it wasn't until I went to university. And I was in university, and I was in my 4th year there at Trent University in Peterborough, and there was a protest. There was a protest against a benefactor of the university, Bada, who was from South Africa, and they were funding the university. And because of apartheid, that was not seen as very good, and so there was protest against that. And then I thought to myself, what's the difference with what I'm seeing and learning about in South Africa versus what I've experienced growing up north? And those reservations that are in Canada are also reservations that we find across the United States. So it was a great opportunity to return north to become the inaugural Dean of Science at the time at Algoma University. It's got a special mission. It's on the site of a former residential school. I didn't know about those in high school. There was one that burned down in Spanish Ontario just east of us, and someone told us that it was an orphanage. There I was, 19 years old, and I wasn't told the truth. And so what I'm doing now and what I've learned about living here in this territory is the importance of social and environmental injustices. And what I do as part of my work is to make sure I address those. So here's Benny. And so Benny has an interesting story. He had a difficult life as a young adult. He is from northern Lake Superior, and he's rediscovered the Modzu, which in Anishinaabe, Ojibwe language, means living the good life. And so he's gone back to being in touch with the land. And unfortunately, climate change is having an impact on his ability to carry out his responsibilities to his family, his responsibilities to the land. And that's because the lakes are changing. It's no longer safe to be on the lakes. So he has a limited opportunity now to share the technology of ice fishing with gill nets in the wintertime under ice with his grandchildren. And there's also language that goes with that technology. And so he's losing the opportunity to share the language with the children. And so climate change is having an impact, not only on the ability to catch fish in the winter, but also to have a language. So it's a cultural impact. The speaker later this morning is Dr. Tom Holson from Clarkson University, an environmental chemist and engineer. And this is work that he did. And it shows that from 2004 to about 2010, there was an increase in these contaminants, hexabromocyclododecanes, which are a flame retardant, and they were getting into fish, and you can see those on the slides there over time. And what they've noticed is that in the upper lakes, lakes Superior and Michigan, the concentrations start to go down. Lake Huron stayed about the same, but in Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, the concentrations have actually increased recently, even though these substances have been restricted in their use and less of them are getting into the lakes. The reason is twofold. One is change in the invasive species dynamics, and also climate change. Less ice cover that's covering the nearshore zones allows for more winter storms to stir up the sediments and to bring up that legacy contaminant which gets into the food chain. So losing winter will mean we're going to get more of these contaminants in the fish. There's a picture from earlier this month that was talked about just moments ago, where these ships are stuck in the ice because they can't get downstream. The bottom slide over here shows the ice level in across the Great Lakes for this year, which is the red line, and the blue line shows the red line is the average, and the dark blue line is the ice level in the lakes so far this year. And you can see that 2026, even though it's freaking cold, as they say, is nowhere near different than average over the past 52 years. However, just 2 years ago, we had one of the lowest levels ever recorded of ice in the Great Lakes. And unfortunately, the data show that we are losing ice cover in the Great Lakes. We're losing about 5% per decade. So if you do the math on this, by the year 2108, 80 years from now, there will be no ice on the Great Lakes. It might even come faster. So I would encourage those of you who have grandchildren to go out and show them this landscape, this frozen landscape, and show them what it's like. So they'll remember, so they'll be able to tell their grandchildren, which will be about 80 years down the road, that they remember there being ice in this area, because there won't be at the rate it's going. So the other thing is that we can't conflate climate change with weather. We can have cold years, but what's happening is we're losing our ice cover. Why is this important? Well, some work that we did with the IJC when I first started there as a science advisor back in 2014 was doing an assessment of the amount of emerging technology that's being used to observe the lakes. And the feedback I got back from folks was that the winter time is an unknown. It's very dark from an observational point of view. A lot of technology is not being deployed. You can't put buoys out in the wintertime. They get swept away by the ice. You need different technologies. And so there's a lack of information about what happens in the wintertime. So let's now to tell you a bit more about what we do know about the Great Lakes and in the wintertime. And a lot of it actually has to go back 88 years to a professor from the University of Ohio. Chandler was his name, and he did a number of studies in the West Basin where he put a shanty out on the ice, and he also had a buoy out there, and he lived out there for 2 years. It's kind of an interesting scenario, but anyway, he published some very interesting information. And it was the majority of what we knew about wintertime in the Great Lakes. Of the other lakes, there's hardly any information about winter limnology, and there's just a smattering of information that took place between the 1940s and the year 2000. Well, I'm happy to say that I was part of this resurgence of winter limnology across the Great Lakes. And so a group of us, young professors at the time, were involved with trying to understand microbial ecology. So we put together our group called Melee, Microbial Ecology of Lake Erie Ecosystems. And we'd spend a week or 2 weeks out on Lake Erie in the middle, usually July, August, and we'd do all our science and we'd understand how the lake was functioning. We had a pretty good feel about what was going on, the work was getting published. But we asked ourselves, what's happening in the rest of the year? Because year after year, you measure the same things. What about other times of the year? The fall, the spring, the winter. So I was fortunate to get some ship time from the Natural Sciences Engineering Research Council in Canada to provide a week of ship time, and they said, when would you like it? And I said, as late in the year as possible. And they said, are you sure? And I said, yeah. So I knew about, the winds of November and all that stuff. I've heard the song. So I said, November, the latest date would be the first week of November. So off we went, and we spent most of our time avoiding waves and wind, and spent most of our time in the east basin of Lake Erie. However, what we saw was quite intriguing. Very low chlorophyll levels, because the light was diminishing, very turbid water as well. Very different in the summertime. And so we said to ourselves, we have to know what happens in the winter. And we supposed that it would probably be a lot less activity, because everyone knows that winter is a lull, the time to rest. So we, our first cruise is 2007. We shipped out of Amherstburg, which is just south of Detroit on the Detroit River. And as we're going through the shipping channel, we saw this brown ice that splashed, this brown water that splashed up on top of the ice, and we thought, oh, it's only 10 meters deep here, so it's probably prop wash. But by the time we got to the central basin, which is over 23 meters deep, we saw the same type of thing. And there's no way that's prop wash. So we took a closer look at it, and we found out that it was actually diatoms, so algae. Those are algae that you see in that top middle picture. It's an electron photomicrograph of what are called diatoms, golden brown algae to common people. And they have these pigments that make them look brown. They have these silica shell walls. They make really good zooplankton food, which is really good food for fish. And we found them in the ice, under the ice, in the water column as well. And so they were all over the place. And the concentrations exceeded what we see in the summertime. And it was quite remarkable, because we were not expecting that whatsoever. And we wondered, what is going on here? Very heterogeneous distribution. So the question is, how did this stuff get there? How did the algae get in such high abundance? Because you don't see this organism in the summertime. It dies at anything warmer than 10 degrees Celsius. So it's only active in the winter. So my colleague, one time, I got a little prop here. You got to watch my hands. Okay, so we collected some algae and in a net, and he wanted to keep them alive to look at a microscope the next day. And so I said, why don't you put them in some filtered water? So I had some filtered water. And so we put the algae in the one container. And then there wasn't room in the fridge, so I said, just put them in the cooler. I keep them on the deck. Filtered water doesn't freeze because it stays warm enough. So the next morning, he opens up the cooler, and all his bottles that had the algae that were in the filtered water were frozen. The filtered water was unfrozen. And so that was what they call serendipity, because my colleague, he's really smart, he followed up on it. And him and his PhD student and a number of others actually isolated ice nucleating proteins from the bacteria that associate with these algae. And so they're actually inducing the formation of ice. So there's a connection. And it also helps explain what we see when we look out on the lake. And so this is a satellite image, and you can see, hopefully you can see there's certain bands from the north looking south of the lake. There's certain bands. Those bands occur with these northern winds that come during the day, stop at night, come during the day, stop at night. What that does is causes supercooled water on the near shore zone, pushes all that nucleating ice into what's called these accumulations of frazzle ice, and it floats on the surface. So it's an entrainment of the sediment with the algae in the ice. Now they're in the perfect position to grow because they get all the sunlight and all the nutrients. And actually, you can see these on the any time that it's not cloudy on the satellite image, which is great. And now we know actually how those bands form. So the question is, you know, is this important? How important is this biomass in the lake? So this is the kind of thing you'll see. You'll see really dense in some areas and not so dense in others, really close. So how important is that? There's a lot of it out there. Well, you've probably heard of Lake Erie as being notorious for having a dead zone, which microbiologists call a way too alive zone, by the way. Because the bacteria and fungi will consume the oxygen in the bottom waters. That happens in the summertime, towards the end of the summer. It also coincides with cyanobacterial blooms, blue-green algae, which you can see at the top in the satellite image. Shows extensive blooms. You can see how polluted those beaches get. You know, you don't want your kid to swim in there because they'll disappear. And the story that you'll hear, you know, from this is over here from a US EPA website of the day, was that those cyanobacteria cause the low oxygen in the bottom waters, because the algae sinks and consumes the oxygen. But as it turns out, it's not the cyanobacteria that's doing it. It's the winter diatoms. Those are the ones that are responsible for consuming the oxygen in summer, because all those algae sink to the bottom. When stratification occurs, those bottom waters are warmer than 10 degrees. Those diatoms die, they start consuming the oxygen. And so that makes us have to understand what causes them to grow so much in the wintertime if we want to control that type of hypoxia, not the phosphorus that's getting in the summertime. There's also information that we published on how changing phytoplankton communities is actually going to reduce fish productivity, because the plankton community will change if you have less ice on the surface of the lake. So our first study of the modern era, we'll call it, there was 4 of us out on the icebreaker looking at winter limnology in Lake Erie. Just a couple of years ago, this past year, we published a paper. We called it Winter Grab. There's 34 of us from all across the Great Lakes, went out and grabbed water, did a whole slew of measurements. I'm going to show you a couple. Don't even try to look at those. Just, I'm trying to impress upon you that all of a sudden there's a lot more people involved in this. And there's even a Winter Grab 2, which is 2023 to 2025, just ended, and there's about 72 people involved with that. So it's growing. And I'd be remiss not to mention oil. We know the importance of oil spill and how it caused this organization, Save the River, to be founded. We are fortunate to have a very large grant from Natural Resources Canada. It's called the Multiple Partner Research Initiative, or MPRI. There's 9 different institutions, over 24 researchers involved. What we're looking at is oil spills, and oil spills in the Great Lakes, oil spills at a time of year that's not summer. So looking at oil in fall when things get cold, in spring when it gets cold. The reason being is that we need to know what the impact is on our ecosystem, and I'm almost embarrassed to say we're actually doing this. We know it's not going to be good. However, we need to have the data to show government, to show the public that these will be the effects of having oil spills at this time of year. And so we're working on not only looking at environmental impacts by doing mesocosm studies, as you see in the middle stream, pouring water, crude oil and marine diesel on St. Mary's River water. St. Mary's River is the outflow of Lake Superior, but also installing sensors to measure oil in our waters, and also testing them to make sure they work in weather like we're currently enjoying. Okay, so now the meat of the talk here. This is our report. So hopefully you've got a good feel for what winter limnology is about. I'm going to talk about the work we did at the International Joint Commission with the Great Lakes Science Advisory Board. As I mentioned, I was a science advisor for 11 years on the board. working with other experts across the Great Lakes. And the beauty of that was that we were able to have the ability to answer questions for the IJC, who they got from the public in some cases, and also to pose our own questions about what's the status of winter science in the Great Lakes. We know we need to know more about it. We convinced the IJC to actually fund this work. And so if you're not familiar with the IJC, it's a treaty-bound organization that was founded in 1909 to prevent disputes between Canada and the United States.
Okay.
There are 14 watersheds across our shared border, and the largest, by far the majority of the work that the IJC does, about 80% of the work, is in the Great Lakes, St. Lawrence River region. Has a number of boards. The St. Lawrence Lake Ontario Board of Control is one. There's a Lake Superior Board of Control. There's a Health Professionals Advisory Board, and there's a Great Lakes Science Advisory Board, which has two committees, a research coordination committee and a science priorities committee. So two of us, one from each committee, got together and said, how about looking at winter science, because it's really important. And so our objective was to understand what's happening in the lake, all the lakes, and then to propose some solutions to make up those data gaps and knowledge gaps. So these are the work group, and you might recognize some names there if you've got really good eyes. I was the co-chair of this group along with Maggie Xenopoulos of Trent University. She was the co-chair representing the Science Priority Committee. And we had a number of different rights holders and stakeholders from across the Great Lakes region, academics and agency folks and people from First Nations involved. We had a contractor team from Limnotech that worked on this for us, so they would do the majority of the labor involved. And we had three different workshops. We looked at research coordination, we looked at science priorities, and we put them all together. And so there was another 60 people involved, in addition to this people in the work group. So the report is actually based on quite a bit of gathering of information from people who are knowledgeable in the area. So the next thing is we looked at, we did a literature review to find out what are the impacts on Great Lakes water quality. So we looked at physical, biological, biogeochemical, and socioeconomic factors. And these are the outputs, so what we learned from this. Okay. Is this better? Yeah. All right, sorry about that. So we looked at, from the physical point of view, we know that there's going to be more coastal erosion, soil erosion, etc. Safety issues will be important because of ice loss and ice strength. There's going to be socioeconomic impacts, especially out in North Shore of Lake Huron and in Superior. A lot of people use ice roads, and in fact, I think there's ice roads down here. There's also in Akwesasne, I know there's ice roads there as well. And so those are going to be changing. And so there's a number of information that we need to know about. From the point of view of biological, there's going to be fish changes that are going to be occurring. There's higher likelihood of aquatic invasive species because the water is going to be warmer, and it's going to be a lot different situation. And so there's information that's needed on pretty much everything regarding biology. So with biogeochemical information, there's studies, the studies showed that there's going to be more eutrophication or nutrient enrichment taking place in the Great Lakes. There's going to be more health-related issues due to things like primarily cyanobacteria and resuspension of bacteria in drinking water. And so a lot more information needed on a number of different biogeochemical aspects, including road salt. So you think, why road salt? It's getting warmer, don't we need less road salt? No, because we know here, especially in this area, with less ice cover, you're going to get more lake effect snow. And the region's getting hammered by lake effect snow from Sault Ste. Marie down to the Tug Hill. And we use road salt because it's cheap and it's readily available in the Great Lakes, and it's easy to move around on ships. Now for the socioeconomic and cultural values, there's going to be longer shipping seasons. We've seen that already, and the shipping industry is going to click into knowing that there's less ice cover, so they are going to be more active. It's going to be cheaper, going to be less ice-breaking costs, a little bit higher insurance, etc. People actually might start moving around because of climate migration. And so more people are expected to come to the Great Lakes region in the future, adding a burden to many different things. So we need to know more information on ecosystem services and actually human well-being. And so what can we do? So these are the results from the workshop. We took the information from the literature surveys. The folks worked together with their own experiences and information and put forth some recommendations. And so we need more monitoring and surveillance. We don't know what happens in the wintertime much because the ships don't go out. Environment Canada doesn't go out in the wintertime, neither does the US EPA. So where do we get our information? So we need to do some new technologies. And one might be something like the technology that we put in the Moses Saunders Dam from 2014 to COVID, essentially where we had instrumentation measuring water quality as it came downstream, and that was 365 days a year over that time span. We need more modeling and forecasting to take place, and that is really a challenge now with the cuts that the current US federal administration did to NOAA in the Great Lakes region. You can have data, but you actually have to share the data. And so the Great Lakes Observing System is a nonprofit funded through NOAA, and their mandate is to make sure that the data that are collected are actually put in a form that's usable not only to agencies, decision makers, but also to the public. And this has to be done particularly for any data that we collect in the wintertime. Collaboration and cooperation, I heard this already this morning from Bridget, and it's a foundation of environmental governance. And so this has to be coordinated for the wintertime observations that we need to make, because there are challenges in the wintertime. We don't have all the infrastructure. It needs to be shared, and we have to collaborate and cooperate with one another to get things done. Not everyone can get out on an icebreaker. We need more icebreakers. They're very expensive. But even if you get out there, or if you go out on hovercraft or on snowmobiles, get out on the lakes, you need to have people who are trained on how to do that safely. And fortunately, folks that are in our Great Lakes Winter Information Network actually got funding from the National Science Foundation in the United States to host a workshop where they taught students on how to safely sample in the wintertime. And so these kinds of activities need to be done more often. And there's also communication and outreach. Again, one of the actions of environmental governance. And if you get Science Magazine, 2 days ago, this was on the cover. It was talking about an ice fishing tournament and what motivates people to get out there and do things. And it's just something that needs to be considered. We're losing our winter before we know how important it really is. And that's a theme I'll probably repeat one more time before I stop in a couple minutes. So these are the 3 recommendations that this working group made to the International Joint Commission. So we present to the commissioners. There's 3 Americans, 3 Canadians. They represent their nation, but their sole purpose is to work together to establish a consensus to protect the waters for the good of the waters, not exactly the nation itself. And so the recommendations that we provided them, they accepted, and there were 5. And so that means that they've now communicated these recommendations to the US EPA and to Environment and Climate Change Canada, and how they're now expected to act upon them. And so what we need to do is obviously collect more data and support any nascent winter limnology groups that are out there, because there's a growing number of those folks that will end up in the agencies. A lot of these are academics, and so this is the training ground for folks to get into the agencies who end up doing the work on winter limnology. So find out what winter gaps are, or what data gaps are missing, so you can address them by monitoring. You still want to measure everything because it's not feasible. We also need to have a very well-developed binational plan, and that is something that the Canadians and Americans have a long history of doing. They just have to refocus now on focusing more on winter time. And essentially, another one is to establish a winter database. So those are the 3 recommendations. Actually 5. So in conclusion, the Great Lakes in the wintertime, highly variable. 2024, the water is open. Now it's frozen solid. It changes radically from season to season, and even the shoulder seasons, the spring and the fall, are equally unknown. So we also are missing a lot of data. There's nowhere near the same database you have as in the summertime, and so we really don't know how the lakes function properly, as you saw from the literature review. And so we're trying to manage a lake, if you can do that. We're trying to manage it with a limited amount of information. It's just not going to be very successful. So we'll be more efficient if we know more. And we know that the lakes are changing. We're losing our ice cover. That's known. So we have to prepare for that. And one last slide here before I get off. This is a picture one morning, very similar to this morning, except it was cloud covered, and it was frozen. The lake was frozen solid. But the evening before, the ship pulled in, hove to, out in the central basin of Lake Erie, and ice shards had broken. And these shards were probably, halfway to the ceiling and about 2 meters wide and 3 to 4 inches thick. And they were bobbing in the water, so most of them were submerged. And it was calm, and these shards of ice were banging into each other like chimes, and you could hear it. And there's this, just like a song, a chorus of this ice in the water. And the next morning it was frozen solid. It looked like this. All the shards were piled up together, the ship had pushed them all together, they froze. It's almost like a metaphor, because without having made the observation, having been there in place, making the observation, you wouldn't have heard that music. And the next day I said, oh, it's just a frozen lake. So with that, back a slide, and thank you for your